So the 70s were a decade of musical earthquakes. Rock splintered into 1,000 directions with progressive, glam, heavy metal, punk, fusion, just to name a few. And in that collision of styles, giants were born. We still remember the names that filled the stadiums: Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Genesis, Queen. Yet for each and every one of those bands that ascended to Olympus, there were those who had talent, the ambition, and often the brilliance, but never quite found their place in the firmament. Now, emerging from Quebec, Morse Code were one of the few French-Canadian prog rock bands that really dared to stand toe-to-toe with their European heavyweights of that era. Their albums, particularly La Marche de Rome in 1975 and Procreation in 1976, were full of symphonic grandeur. They drew comparisons to Yes and Genesis, but with a unique French lyrical flair. And the band's use of rich vocal harmonies and intricate instrumental passages really showcase a group that was really technically gifted and emotionally powerful. But unfortunately, the barrier of language proved a stumbling block in cracking this English-speaking market. And that really dominated the industry at that time. Today, however, Morse Code's music stands really as a testament to the global reach of progressive rock. Yet they remain a cult treasure, really, rather than a household name. Now, few bands have embodied the experimental daring of early 70s Britain quite like Fusion Orchestra. Fronted by the charismatic Jill Saward, their soul album Skeleton and Armour from 1973 remains a staggering blend of hard rock, jazz fusion, folk and even classical motifs. Saward's voice could pivot from ethereal delicacy to raw rock power, while the band's musicianship, especially Colin Dawson's inventive guitar work, was nothing short of breathtaking. However, being both too eclectic and somewhat too early, they never really fit neatly into a single scene. And in an era when radio and record labels demanded clear labels and marketable identities, Fusion Orchestra's refusal to comprise really left them stranded, and really remembered only by those adventurous enough to dig into the vaults. Now, you would think, being produced by Greg Lake of Emerson, Lake and Palmer fame, the band's spontaneous Combustion seemed destined for big things. Their debut in 1972, it just bristled with energy, combining an urgency of hard rock with the complexity of progressive structures. Tracks like Time Will Come showcased a youthful intensity. It blended fuzzed out guitar riffs with swirling keyboards in ways that really should have propelled them into wider acclaim. But despite this promising start, they really struggled to maintain any kind of momentum, and this was partly because their sound, although powerful, was competing in an already crowded space and was dominated by some mighty heavyweight giants. Now, they remain a fascinating case of a band that had both pedigree and promise, but never really managed to ignite beyond cult recognition. Badger were also a prog rock supergroup of sorts, formed by ex-Yes keyboardist Tony Kaye and bassist David Foster, who had collaborated with John Anderson before Yes broke it big. Their debut album, One Life Badger from 1973, was unusual and been recorded live straight out of the gate, but it just captured both their technical prowess and their improvisational spirit. And musically, they balanced the melodic sensibilities of Yes with a bluesy undercurrent, and it had given them quite a distinctive flavour. However, Typically, the constant lineup changes and lack of clear direction really hampered their momentum, and really by the time their sophomore album, White Lady in 1974, had appeared, the band's sound had shifted into soul-infused territory that really alienated their early prog fans. Badger served as a cautionary tale of talent undermined by inconsistency, leaving behind only tantalising glimpses of what could have been. Now, if ever a band embodied the eccentricity of English music, it was Stackridge. Blending whimsical lyrics, pastoral folk melodies, and progressive rock experimentation, they were often described as the missing link between the Beatles and prog. Their early albums, the self-titled one in 1971 and Friendliness in 1972, sparkle really with playful invention, featuring songs about anthropomorphic animals, surreal landscapes, and joyous absurdity. Critics praised them, but audiences never fully embraced their quirky approach, particularly in that era that was increasingly dominated by harder, more straightforward sounds. Still, Stackridge left quite an indelible mark on British pop's left-field tradition, influencing later acts such as XTC, who would take their eccentricity to really much greater heights. Formed from the members of Blossom Toes and other British underground groups, Paladin brought a unique blend of progressive rock and funk-driven rhythms. Now, their self-titled debut in 1971 aimed towards jazz rock, but it was their second album, Charging, from 1972, that was produced by Jeff Emerick of Beatles fame, that really solidified their reputation among collectors. With some fiery guitar work, brass flourishes, and really a rawer energy than many prog contemporaries, Paladin straddled genres in a way that made them difficult to market. Those very qualities that made them distinctive, that unwillingness to sit still musically, it ultimately limited their commercial reach. Today, Charge is revered as a lost gem, evidence of a band that might have reshaped the whole prog landscape, had fortune favoured them just a little bit better. Now, unlike many of the bands we've got in this list here, Steve Hillage is a name that really hovers on the edge of wider recognition. Emerging from that psychedelic collective Gong, Hillage's solo career in the mid to late 70s produced albums such as Fish Rising in 75 and L in 1976, which combined cosmic soundscapes with virtuosic guitar work. Now, his style bridged progressive rock and the burgeoning electronic movement, with collaborations involving Todd Rundgren and later explorations into ambient and really dance music. But despite his innovations, Hillage never quite broke into the mainstream stardom. He was often overshadowed by flashier guitar heroes of that era. Yet his influence rippled forward, inspiring later electronic acts like The Orb, who worked with him directly in the 1990s, proving that sometimes greatness is measured in legacy rather than sales. Now, often grouped with the post-punk movement of the late 70s, the Monochrome set were outliers from the start. They had a sound that combined jangly guitars, right and literal lyrics, and an arch detachment that really prefigured the indie pop movement of the 80s. With songs like Ein Symphonie des Grauens, they showcased a knack for blending art school wit with infectious melodies. However, that refusal to chase trends coupled with limited promotion really kept them hovering on the margins rather than breaking through commercially. In hindsight, this band's DNA can be traced through countless indie bands that followed, making them really one of the most quietly influential lost groups of their time. Now, Home were a British progressive rock band whose lineup included future stars such as Cliff Williams, later of AC/DC. Now, their albums, Pause for a Horse in 1971 and Home in 1972, and also The Alchemist in 1973, revealed really a band that was of considerable ambition, partly on the latter, which was a concept album steeped in mythological themes. Musically, Home balanced melodic songwriting with really quite intricate musicianship, often compared to Wishbone Ash for their dual guitar harmonies. But yet, despite opening for heavyweights like Led Zeppelin and Slade, they never managed to capture the same level of mass appeal. Ultimately, their story is one of immense potential, really, that just dissolved as some of its members went on to brush with true stardom elsewhere. Now, perhaps no band on this list is more notorious than Black Widow, who rose to brief infamy in the early 1970s for their overt flirtation with occult themes.
And practices once more exposed, yet everyone should know.
Their debut album, Sacrifice in 1970, really featured ritualistic lyrics, dark atmospheres, and even stage black masses during live performances. Musically, however, they were far more than mere shock merchants. Their fusion of progressive rock with jazz-influenced arrangements set them apart from the era's heavier occult-tinged peers like Black Sabbath. Yet their controversial image proved a double-edged sword. While it won them headlines, it also alienated radio and cautious record labels. Black Widow remains one of the most fascinating what-ifs of the decade. That idea of a band whose theatrical daring foreshadowed later shock rock icons, but who never reaped their rewards. So looking back, the 1970s were a crucible of invention where really every week seemed to birth a new sound, a new idea, a new contender for greatness. Those bands that we've featured here, Morse Code, Fusion Orchestra, Spontaneous Combustion, Badger, Stackridge, Paladin, Steve Hillage, the Monochrome Set, Home, and Black Widow, these all represent the paths not taken, the futures that might have been. They remind us that history is written not just by the visitors, but also by those who really, for reasons often beyond their control, just simply never reached the summit. And whilst their music remains really vibrant, strange and powerful, just waiting to be rediscovered by listeners willing to check out and listen to the canon. But in the end, though, perhaps their greatest triumph is that their work still feels alive, pushing with the restless ambition of an era that really refused to stand still. Now, I'm sure there are other bands that will fall into this category, so leave any examples that you have for me in the comments section, if you will. Remember to check out the description section, where there is extra details on these bands, as well as helpful purchase links to buy any one of the albums if you don't already have them in your collection. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Now, I did shoot another video about bands from the 70s that didn't quite make it, and that's the one I want you to watch next. I'll see you over there.